Alex Mozet, and welcome to Winner Take All, where we talk about the constant battle between large tech monopolies and traditional incumbents. I'm very excited that today we have guest speaker Tim Kendall. You may have seen him on the recent documentary called The Social Dilemma. He has presented materials in front of Congress on what's going on with platforms. He's been working in Facebook at the early days, Pinterest, and most recently is also CEO of Moment, which we will definitely be getting into today. So, Tim, great to have you, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for having me on.
You know, if I was to give my one sentence overview and overgeneralize things, I want to hear it from you. It seems like what you were saying, whether it was in the testimony, which we've actually covered on the show, obviously, you know, the documentary that so many folks have seen, Social Dilemma. It seems like kind of what you're getting at here is these big content platforms like Facebook, they're matchmaking the algorithms that are, you know, connecting users with what content they see has been, I would say, corrupted by greed, right? These algorithms have been trained to send you stuff that maximizes for engagement. And what the algorithms have figured out is that the way they get the most engagement is to send you, you know, the salacious, triggering content, much of it fake content, but nonetheless, these algos have performed their job and have really maximized engagement, and then they serve more ads and make more money. Am I off, or am I, you know, how would you put it in your words?
Well, I think that's pretty close. You know, I think that the word greed implies that there's like some intention, that we can absolutely know the intention of the company, which I don't think we can, their underlying motive. It also sort of implies that maybe the algorithm has a motive, which it doesn't. But what I think it's safe to say is that the algorithm has been given a mandate, which is to say, okay, we got Alex on this service. Algorithm, go figure out how to get Alex to spend more time on it tomorrow and a little bit more time on it the next day. And it doesn't, obviously, the company doesn't supply the algorithm with a reason why. But look, like, you know, Facebook and these other companies are publicly traded, and they need to grow at a steady and persistent rate in order to maintain their large valuations. And their large valuations are how they keep and retain and attract the people who build the service. So it's this interwoven system that's kind of built upon itself that really does start with, you know, the product and the service, which is designed to extract more and increasing amounts of our attention in order to generate the revenue, increasing amounts of revenue, which then leads to a persistent and growing valuation, which then allows us to hire more and more people to work on these algorithms to make them better and more sophisticated. You know, I think maybe a slightly different tack is that in terms of describing the problem is you've got an attention extractive based business model paired up with a all-knowing technology that is getting smarter and more sophisticated every day. And it's a technology that in many ways, in certain dimensions, knows you better than you know yourself, and certainly knows the dimensions of your human weaknesses better than you understand them. And that is what is, I think that's what's scary. And I think the other thing that's scary is that there's sort of this separation between the leaders of the company and then the actual algorithm is in part what's scary, because the management leaders can say, well, what's so bad about getting Alex to spend a little bit more time on the platform tomorrow? And they can say that sort of with a straight face when we're talking about an artificially intelligent algorithm that's kind of taking care of the content aggregation and sorting on its own, because they don't have to necessarily know the how of this algorithm. And in many cases, I don't think completely do understand the how. And this is really how we've gotten into this jam, right? Which is that you've got an algorithm that's started to, by virtue of what you've mandated it to do, started to wreak havoc on the individual in terms of their mental health, and on society in terms of the fabric of how society functions. And what Facebook and others seem to be continuing to do is they're a bit late to the party in understanding the severity of the ramifications. I think the best illustration of this, and then I'll pause. The best illustration of this is the 2016 election, whereby it is quite clear in retrospect that 2016 election was swayed, and the artificial intelligence algorithms, and combined with the meddling, probably tipped the election. The company, including its leader, didn't acknowledge or completely understand that until months or years later. And that's what this disaggregation of like the leadership and then the actual underlying algorithm, that's an example of the problem it creates.
This idea of, there's a black box. You got matchmaking is in the book, right? We actually describe matchmaking as one of the 4 core functions of the platform business model, right? Along with rules and standards, which I think we'll get into a little bit later today, when it comes to kind of censorship and how do you kind of curate that ecosystem. But just around the matchmaking, I think is what you're getting at here is there's a disconnect between, management, whether what their understanding is, what their goals are as a public company, what they need to do to serve as shareholders, et cetera. And then, essentially, well, what is the mechanism that this black box, this matchmaking, this algorithm, this AI is achieving these results, and to what end? And I actually have up here is your testimony to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, right? Where we had covered this when you had first done this, right? Where you're talking about here, I was director of monetization at Facebook, and it seems like there was this moment for you when you started to say, this is great, we can achieve these KPIs and growth and engagement, but at what cost, right? And where there was this kind of moral epiphany that or tipping point where you said, you look at the impact that this engagement is having, and you look at how the algorithm is accomplishing this engagement, and you look at what that's doing to the individual, and you say, this isn't good, right? What was there that kind of moment in time, that threshold where you were just said, oh, it's just too much?
Yeah, I'm a little embarrassed to admit that it wasn't that long ago, right? Like I think that I came at it maybe a little bit differently than most who are now speaking out about it, in that I think that I was initially what the flag in my head was really around mental well-being, in that, I started noticing when I was still at Pinterest, looking around, the restaurant and seeing everybody on their phone, seeing families of 4 or 5, and no one was talking to each other. And I was, and I've shared this in other forums, like I have seen, I've been around addiction for a long time in my family and extended family. And so I know how it operates and how corrosive it can be. And I know sort of the generalistic behaviors that are associated with it. And so I was noticing in myself, and I was noticing in people around me, that there are absolutely, there are ways that we treat this phone that mimic how people treat addictive substances, in terms of denial, in terms of not wanting to part with it, having withdrawal characteristics when they are separated from their phone. And so that's what threw the flag up for me originally was, wow, there is something about this supercomputer in our pocket and the services that have been built on top of it that are just sucking us in a way where, and this is really where the definition of addiction plays, where we are unable to make decisions that are in our best interest in the medium and long term because of the sheer magnitude of the temptation in the short term. I mean, this is what happens with drugs and alcohol, right? Like the alcoholic or the drug addict knows that the next day they're not going to feel good. And they know that there could be even longer term ramifications of them, drinking a lot tonight. But the near-term feedback loop is just too enticing. And we see that in the abstract. That plays out with the phone every hour of the day for a lot of us.
Absolutely. And I mean, I want to come, let's go to, we're going to have a lot to dig into.
Yeah.
The nitty gritty on Facebook and these content platforms. But I think this is a nice segue to say, we've seen, for example, I would say they have tried, Apple's giving you some controls and lock in, but I've got Moment up here and that I'm sharing. Take me through this, right? To me, what's interesting is there is a component here which is saying, how do you cut down on your phone usage and kind of this addiction, which is absolutely true. And there's a myriad of evidence to support that, but also about building stronger and closer relationships, with that key circle. I thought that was also a very interesting kind of part to this. So what's your overview for how would you describe Moment? And I think that's some of your day-to-day these days, right?
Yeah. I think there are kind of three pieces to Moment. And the third piece is actually kind of turned into a whole nother project that I'm working on that I can touch on because it does relate to how we interact and have relationships and sustain relationships with people. But with Moment, it's really about helping people develop awareness. People are not aware most of the time of how much they use their phone. Most people think they use it 2 hours a day. We ask them that at the front end of their experience, or we have asked them that historically, and then they measure it and they realize, oh, it's like 4 hours a day. So they're off, but that's how disconnected perception is from reality. And just that awareness wake up is helpful for people. Then we have a whole series of tips and tricks for people who want them, right? To get their device into a realm where people can behave more deliberately around their phone as opposed to sort of unconsciously, where they can't really predict, I'm going to spend an hour of my day hour today on my phone or 5 hours. I don't know. We'll see what happens. And then the last thing is we have found, and this is true in a lot of the research on behavioral addiction, which is really what this phone thing is, that groups of people and co-committing to behavior change is really one of the most effective ways to catalyze behavior change and sustain it. So within Moment, we have an ability for you to form a group of people who can kind of co-develop habits and keep each other accountable, because the group feature within Moment allows you to see how much each person in the group is using their phone. So that's pretty useful.
And you've had over 8 million users, right? Something like that today.
Yeah, we have 8 million people who have at various points through the last several years have downloaded the product. So a lot of demand for it. And then I think in looking at this problem, we've learned that there's sort of an adjunct problem, which is just that, which I would summarize as, we've never been more connected to one another in the history of the world, while at the same time, we've probably never as a collective species felt more lonely.
Right.
Which to us presents an opportunity whereby, well, that sort of suggests that maybe these services that are supposed to help with our socialness aren't actually working as designed, or certainly aren't working in our best interest. So we've actually endeavored to build a product, and we've built about 5 different prototypes in this area. We're still experimenting. It's going to take a while, I think, to get it right, which is, okay, if I started from scratch and I just wanted to build something for Alex that would really help him create and sustain, because your friendships already exist. Like, think of the 5 to 10 people in your life to whom you care about the most. How do we help you dedicate your mind share and attention to those people in a sustained way that helps you feel close to them? Because it turns out that if you can achieve that, you actually can do more for someone's health and well-being than if you put them on a diet or give them an exercise regimen or have them quit smoking cigarettes. Like, your social well-being is actually the biggest predictor of longevity. It's the biggest predictor of pushing out the onset of disease. And it's the biggest predictor of how good you feel about the quality of your life at the end of it. So it seems silly that there isn't something that guides and helps people to do that. We sort of leave it all to chance. We're counting calories over here and making sure that I spend, 2 hours a week on my Peloton, but I'm not keeping track of anything as it relates to my relationships. It's tricky because you don't want to turn it into a customer relationship management software program, right? That, like, you got all your friends in Salesforce. So it's just trying to thread that needle. But we think it's a really interesting problem, and one that really does. It really is a byproduct opportunity of how social networks have been built with this attention extractive model, which has allowed them to develop into things that don't really serve us around this dimension of just helping me stay close with the people that really matter.
It's breadth versus depth.
Yes.
It's a centimeter deep. And I've got all these people, some I know, some I don't know, and I'm just scrolling through the feed. Versus, now, especially with COVID, right? Where you have just that proximity. Humans are social creatures. And now you literally can't have that proximity in many circumstances. And not to mention, then the vacuum that has probably been created is happily sucked up by these social networks and content platforms.
Yes.
And there's your dilemma in a nutshell, right? And so I really love that idea of I think the time tracking and screen time, that is great. And I think having an independent product separate from the actual addiction creator, that is, say, Apple and on my iPhone, makes sense. I'd want a neutral party to help me kind of cure my own addiction. Curious if you ever run into any issues with Apple, but I'm sure not yet. But maybe eventually. But anyway, this next thing, right? How do you kind of deepen those relationships and just being that kind of mindfulness and attentive and aware? And I think, that's something just society and people need. So I think that's very exciting. And hope you keep us posted on when that product also comes out. Let's go back to the fun punching bag that is Facebook. As I mentioned, on the show, we talk a lot about platform models and all these kinds of things. One of the things that we talk a lot about is matchmaking on one side. Kind of, we touch on that a little bit, right? The algorithms. Hey, Alex, here's your news feed. Here's what's going in it. Maximizing engagement. The other side, which you also talk a lot about, we haven't gotten into it yet, is around what we would qualify rules and standards. How do you figure out who has access to the network? And then how do you curate and regulate the usage once they're in the network? And, you're using these rules and standards to incentivize good behavior and not bad behavior. You talk a lot about censorship in addition to the matchmaking and the algorithm part of this equation. But, those are both gargantuan topics in and of themselves. If you were to sit here and say, which one of these is the bigger problem? Or if you could only solve one, which one do you think has the bigger impact? Is that a fair question? Is there an either, if you had to choose one or the other, does one pop out at you as saying, this is the big kahuna?
Label the problems again.
Matchmaking, the AI black box algorithm giving you this salacious content to maximize engagement. That's one.
Yes.
And then censorship, and what is right, what is wrong censorship. Hey, people are posting this. It's harassing, it's insensitive. What are we going to do? Are we kicking them off? Are we violating free speech? Right? Kind of the censorship bucket, which is pretty big these days too.
My intuition, is that I think if you solve the incentives around the matchmaking, you actually get at the censorship issues.
Yeah, I'm right there with you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I've always thought it was, and I'm not the first person to say this, I've always thought it was silly that Facebook said that they're not the arbiters of truth. But I mean, I guess maybe technically they're not. The algorithm is, though. The algorithm is absolutely playing the arbiter role on an individualized basis. They're distorting what truth is depending on who's on there. And we can talk about this later. We can talk about this now. It has been, I would say, astounding and heartening and surprising and encouraging how much Facebook has moved on this issue in the last 6 to 8 weeks.
You were the director of monetization. I think, for example, if we look at, you've got these algorithms, they're maximizing attention. And the algorithms don't really care if the news is fake or true. If anything, what the algorithms probably, maybe they don't know, maybe they do know, the more salacious material, the more triggering material is probably more fake than it is real. And that actually does better in the algorithm.
Correct.
And then if you say, okay, well, let's look at the media industry. Well, Facebook and Google have pretty much destroyed their business model. You got these media organizations that are just struggling to survive. I feel like every few months there's more layoffs. And, is it almost that Facebook has brought along the media? The media industry has had to learn how to survive, and they are now playing in a system. I've got another little chart here that shows, a nice little graph of just the percentage of people getting their news on social media just going up and up and up and down for the traditional media folks, right? So they're being disintermediated. Facebook and Google are doing the disintermediation. And what those algorithms are saying is the more salacious and triggering stuff, regardless of whether it's true, is probably going to get you more ad dollars. And by the way, you're barely profitable as it is. So, is this kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that, unfortunately, going back to your point, if you can solve that matchmaking challenge, it can help kind of cure some of these other things that we see going on as a byproduct?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's interesting. Like, I have seen some commentary on this that I happen to agree with. That when you think about the degree to which our country has become polarized by virtue of misinformation and echo chambers. So a bunch of the commentary, if you read it in a larger context going back decades, the very beginning of this is actually cable news. The beginning, when they started seeing, and I'm blanking on exactly what the metric was that they used to understand sort of polarized groups of people, but they really started seeing a divergence when cable news took. So when CNN and Fox, in the mid 90s or mid to late 90s really became these, right? They had their own algorithms. They were tuned for different parts of the political spectrum, and people tuned in and they both offered a different, reality distortion field. And what Facebook, so that was news, and that was traditional media curated to fit a group. And in a sense, what Facebook has done is just taken that playbook and atomized it and just multiplied it, created a monster on the basis of that, multiplied out to, as Roger McNamee said in the film, 3 billion Truman shows.
Yeah, I've got my other chart up here now, which is just the downward sloping graph of Americans' trust in mass media.
Yeah.
It's much easier to have standards, really strongly upheld standards when you're profitable. When you're not profitable and, every and death is around the corner, you're in survival mode. And you know this as the startup guy. I mean, survival mode and profit mode are two very different modes.
I think what happens when you're in the survival mode is, it's hard for people to imagine Facebook being in survival mode, but there really were times when we were. There were periods over which growth was flat. There were periods over which it wasn't clear how we were going to grow revenue year over year. And the interesting thing that happens from an organizational psychology standpoint is when you're as an organization in survival mode, what you tell yourself, certainly what I told myself at times, and I've heard about this playing out in other organizations, is you think, well, we'll go do the right thing later. Right. We'll make sure that this thing is buttoned up once we have a little slack in the system. And that's always the realities of capitalism and the quarterly reporting, et cetera, make that really hard.
You were mentioning this that that user growth is so critical. Right. And to me, the interesting thing, if we look at the past few quarters of performance, you had Q2, right? You had the boycott Facebook stuff go into full gear. How did Facebook do Q2? Actually, fantastic. I bought the dip. Facebook was not damaged. Now you have Q3, where there's just a lot of disagreement on either side of the political spectrum in terms of how Facebook has handled itself, for better or for worse. Say mostly, actually, probably both sides think for worse. But we also just saw their Q3 results, and they're fine. If anything, they were actually great. You line that up against Twitter. Twitter had flat user growth, flat from Q2 to Q3 of this year, 36 million DAUs in the US. And that their product matchmaking teams were hitting that algo as aggressively as possible just to maintain par, right? God forbid it should decline. But we saw Twitter stock fall over 20%, day after they released earnings. To me, what that's reflective of, and maybe some of that goes to maybe some of what you're getting at here, is just the, name of the book is Modern Monopolies. I actually don't think Twitter is a monopoly. They're a 30 billion market cap company. They have a strong niche, but it's a niche. They don't have multiple content platforms, right? Like they should have, I think, had their own version of TikTok and they missed that boat. But, Facebook has Facebook and WhatsApp and Instagram. I mean, it is full on platform conglomerate status.
Yep.
And to me, even though there are disgruntled users almost on both sides or, all over the place, you see the juggernaut just actually continue on pretty much completely undamaged, if not stronger for it. And I think you do see vulnerability with the smaller ones like a Twitter, which would be happy to be 1/10 the size of Facebook. And it's not, it's obviously way smaller. Do you see that monopoly status as something that a Facebook or a Google holds, and I guess their willingness to change being influenced by just that market dominance position? Or am I off here?
I think both companies clearly have tremendous power. And I listened to an interview with Emily Chang and from Bloomberg and Bill Gurley, who's a well-known venture capitalist from Benchmark, and she asked the same question about Facebook and Google, and he was diplomatic, but he said, look, he said, we at Benchmark, we invest in these startups, and a lot of times they get into various flavors of conversations with Facebook or Google, and those conversations feel very one-sided. There is a clear David and Goliath dynamic, and I think that's been true for a while. And I think that I don't spend as much time thinking about Google's business as I do Facebook's, because I've never worked there, and I just haven't spent as much time thinking about just like the positional and structural dynamics of Google's business. But Facebook's business, they've got a series of Metcalfe's law networks that, as long as a service is providing generally a good enough service for people, Metcalfe's law network effect services are unassailable. In a way that, a service like Microsoft or Amazon or others, they have sort of a different kind of network effect, but the Metcalfe's law telephone type network effect, original AT&T network effect, that's a hard thing to put a dent in for startups.
So let's run that thread. Okay, you're kind of unassailable here. That's why you're going to the, Congressional Commerce Committee, right? That's why I think what we're saying here is this is the role of government, is to try to fix someone that is unassailable and is harming, their users, their customers. That's why we have multiple different ways that the government could get involved, whether it's, through the courts, whether it's congressionally with laws. Let's say that you had the power anointed, right, to say, okay, I'm going to fix this. What do you think is the best mechanism to do that? There's a lot of talk about 230. There's just a lot of different theories out there that even if you had the power to do something,
yeah,
what do you do? Where does your gut, or what's your first inclination?
I have a somewhat low probability idealistic path. But look, if I had a magic wand, this is what I would suggest we do. I would like to see the leaders of these companies, and let's just, for the moment, to simplify it, just say Facebook, and governments that presumably are responsible for regulating, or not, is the case, maybe not regulating Facebook. And then they're consumers, right? And there are self-anointed and institutionally anointed consumer advocates out there, right? Who have the voice of consumers at the consumer's interests at heart. I think those groups, so Mark, governments from all over the world, and then consumer advocates, an anointed leader or two, I think they need to get together and try to align on what we think reality is today. And what reality is today, in my mind, is that we likely have an existential crisis on our hands with the combination of an extractive-based business model combined with, all-knowing and increasingly sophisticated AI. That can actually be mitigated if we can arrive at a business model for Facebook that aligns users' interests with the interest of Facebook. Because right now they're divergent. Alex's best interests are just not in the best interests of Facebook. Because your best interest is likely for your health and well-being and the goodness of society to spend less time on the product. They need you to spend more. So what I would love is for that group to get together and say, okay, let's share collective responsibility for how we got here. The government's responsible. They let it all happen. Didn't challenge a single acquisition. Didn't take a peek at 230 until, the last year or two. Consumers have been complicit in this, in a sense. We make decisions. We do have independent will. And then the companies have a part to play in this for sure. Okay, so if we can sort of spiritually say, look, the three of us all played a part in this, let's co-create a path out of this. What does a path out of this look like? Well, I think it's not too dissimilar from, going from extractive energy economies, fossil fuel dependent economies, to an economy that gets energy from clean sources and green sources. So we sort of need to come up with the solar version of Facebook, or the electric version of Facebook. And then we need Facebook's commitment and government's commitment and then consumer support to allow that to happen. Consumer advocates would need to advocate for consumers to pay for this sort of thing, if that's in fact the model we agree to go to. Government would need to both create incentives, I think probably tremendous tax incentives for this to happen, right? Because we need a credible path for them to segue and not erode $100 billion a year in revenue. And I think you can do that with tax incentives, potentially.
I mean, you brought up AT&T. You had the government say, I mean, this is basically, we're going to accept that you're a monopoly, but we're going to put guardrails around you. We're going to protect things that you might take advantage of, right? Like kicking people off the network or overcharging, these kinds of things. You made the point earlier, right? The matchmaking here, the algorithm, that curation. Is there a way to open that up, to externalize curation and matchmaking, right? Like, for example, if we took these media companies, which their business model has been destroyed, and said, you know what? Facebook is not going to be allowed to have their own matchmaking algorithm. Now, it's going to be up to third parties. That could be CNN and Fox News. They could use humans, or they could use algorithms, or a mixture of both. It kind of reminds me of like Drudge Report, for example, right? Whereas like Matt Drudge for like 20 years, it was a one-man show, and he's just curating, and he's basically just a curator, right? And is there a form of value creation in the form of curation? And can we remove the platform's ability to own that, or at least put handicaps on that, and maybe focus this kind of amazing brainstorm session that we have and say, your matchmaking isn't going to remain the same. Let's brainstorm a better version to do matchmaking, which Facebook, you're not going to be happy about, because now you can't predict to a T what your earnings are going to be, right? And it's going to be out of your control, but it's going to be better for society, and maybe we'll give you some incentives to make you happy. Is there a focused conversation in that structure that you think would at least have a shot?
I think it's a really compelling brainstorm to have, and I do think it is a way to get at this. It could absolutely be a way to get at this misaligned incentive, and to give people some agency over. Okay, I know I don't have total agency, but at least I can have some, preference around who curates, what I'm doing, or what I'm seeing. So I think it's interesting. I mean, I also think that this is just a caveat on even going down the path of subscription. I think even Netflix is guilty here of being, an extractive attention economy participant, even though they're going down what we say is sort of best practice for consumer service, which is subscription. But look, like they are trying to. I mean, you can just see all the tactics in the product, the pre-rolls, the aggressive, episode 1 flows into episode 2, and then the programming is increasingly being influenced by the viewership data from the past. I mean, they're absolutely using technology to prey on our human weakness. Now, the model is subscription, but like they clearly, there's a crazy earnings call that they had. I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, where some analyst asked on the earnings call, can you talk a little bit about your competition? Expecting them to, make a commentary on Apple TV or HBO Plus or whatever, and Disney Plus. Said, our competition is really our customers' sleep and their relationships. So which couldn't be a more appropriate characterization of the misalignment of their interest with your interests. Their interest is that you get less sleep and have fewer high quality relationships, or certainly more shallow relationships, because you just don't have the time to nurture them. That's their incentive. Your incentive is I think not that.
That black box. What goes into that black box? How can we, transparency is the cure all for all evil and misgivings, right? So how can we shine a big fat light on it? And maybe we don't get all the way there, but
I mean, look, I think transparency helps. I totally agree with you. That's a key principle. I think the part of transparency that seems critical is us as an end user just having more transparency. And we talk about this at Moment, and we're not the first ones to think about it. What is the impact? What is the impact on you, the individual, of spending 5 hours a day on your phone? What happens quantitatively to your psychological well-being, and what happens physiologically as a result of this, and what's happening neurologically? That is a mystery. That is not transparent, but that is a knowable problem that we can get to. And I think if people understood the cost, like it's now relatively clear that if I eat a lot of cookies every night, there will be a consequence to that. And it's probably increasingly in people's intuition, like quantifiable. But it would be helpful, for instance, to know, okay, if I subscribe to Netflix, what is the average impact on my hours of sleep I get at night versus the people who don't subscribe to Netflix? Like there's a transparency just in terms of these services' impact on health and well-being that is not there, but I believe is knowable. And I do think there's an opportunity there. And then it allows us to have make more informed choices. I mean, this was the issue with big tobacco. You could smoke cigarettes in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and you could feel real good about it because you didn't think you were doing anything bad to your body.
And all of that is before you even talk about kids and what's happening to these kids when they get a cell phone in their hands at like age 7. And right. What is that doing to the wiring and the development of the brain? So, yeah. They're absolutely. But let's touch on the censorship thing a little bit. So, you've elsewhere, talked about that these platforms, Facebook, they don't want to be this arbiter of truth, right? And for whatever reason, they have been forced to start taking a side. And once you do take a side, or once you kick off someone here, or you shadow ban there, right? How do you draw that line in an objective way? And it seems like there really is, it's an oxymoron. There is no way to continue to draw that line in an objective way. You're always now going to be put in a position that you took some kind of action and, you have pissed off another part of your community.
And I think that's why, by the way, Mark probably smartly, as it related to Facebook, put this off for as long as possible.
Philosophically, do you think that, that do you see a difference in these content platforms, these social networks, as some being, are they all too closed off, and they need to be more open? Are some getting the balance right, and some are too closed? Are they all too open and need to be more closed? I mean,
what do you mean by open and closed in this context?
I mean, the level of censorship, right? Which is hard to measure. Those stats are kind of difficult to measure, but there's multiple kinds of censorship that we've talked about on the show, right? Yeah. One extreme is I'm kicking you off, I'm banning you from the platform forever. The other one is I'm suspending your account. The other one is I'm shadow banning. I'm limiting the visibility your message gets. Yeah. Another one would be now I'm going to modify, right? I'm going to put an alert. I'm going to modify the content. And when we have this conversation on the show, I like to talk about, try to talk about non-political examples, because everything is so partisan these days. But, when it comes to COVID, for example, there's all these stories about like that Chinese virologist from Hong Kong who was saying that, this COVID was made in a lab. Yeah. And all those videos, and her account she's been banned from multiple platforms. The videos have been taken down. If you're even to show the video of her talking about it, then your account is going to be banned, right? That's what I mean about censorship. Do you think that, these platforms are getting kind of too comfortable with censoring, maybe not everyone, but certain populations? And now it's hard to kind of draw back those lines because you've crossed them. Or how do you see it?
Well, it's so hard. And I know that's not meant to be a cop-out, but if you look back in history around, and look, I have no reason to believe that COVID was created in a lab. I don't believe that. But if you look back in history and you think about some of the newest ideas that then became mainstream, the new ideas are condemned, and the people who talk about them are maligned, right? And so, but we know historically that some small percentage of those become mainstream and adopted. And so what is the process by which, craziness gets properly filtered versus potentially interesting doesn't get overly penalized because it's not proven? And that's a hard, I don't empathize with the social networks having that on their shoulders right now, but guess what? They do, and they're going to have to come up with the principled way to I don't know what you call that problem, but if it's solved incorrectly, you could sort of imagine, we'll never have the counterfactual, right? But you could sort of imagine a bunch of really powerful ideas in the future that never see the light of day because of the way that the lines are drawn.
Earth is the center of the universe. And if you say otherwise, well, you're an idiot and you're out of here, right? Yep. I'm with you. I mean, I personally would say that when it comes to the censorship debate, it's obviously very tough to measure. I would say that Facebook has played that game better than others. And I would say that Zuckerberg has come under a lot of fire for it on both sides. To me, it comes back to the leader and the individual who I feel like there's still something in Zuck, which is saying, we need to resist being too much whack-a-mole and censoring too much.
I agree with you. I mean, I actually think that his defending and coming under a lot of scrutiny around protecting political speech is very important. And actually, in principle, I agree with him. And I also agreed with the caveat that they came up with, or the qualifier to political speech, which is that, look, political speech, we're not going to correct, we're not going to label it, but look, if it's going to incite violence, it has crossed the line. And I think that's the right line to draw with political speech. And I think what we've seen recently, if you rewind 2, 3, 4 months ago, I think that there was a view that hate speech, as long as hate speech doesn't incite direct violence, it's okay. Holocaust denial is okay, as long as in your Holocaust denial group, you don't say, go do the following things that are violent and hurtful to a group of people. And I think what I respect the principle that they use to draw that line, that original line. However, I think that it's a tough thing to argue that a group that is inciting hate is not almost definitionally inciting violence by implication. And I think that's where they landed. I wasn't in the room, but to me, that's why they are now starting to say, well, look, if you incite hate, you are inciting violence.
Well, you know what? It's also interesting that we saw is they started to limit, leading up to the election, the sharing capabilities, right? You can only send this message to 5 people, or
yes.
I don't think they were tampering with the algo, because they need that black box to keep humming. But how do I try and on the fringe clamp down on some of these features I've built that help get this viral nature going?
Yeah. And they're having to make judgment calls and invent on the fly. I mean, deciding to throttle the distribution of Stop the Steal on Thursday or Friday of last week. Do I think that was the right thing to do given the risk of violence? Yeah, I think it's probably defendable, but it's a judgment call, and it's reasonable that 70 million people who voted for Trump think that it's censorship.
The last thing, and then we have 1 or 2 questions from the audience. I know we're going a little bit over. Tim, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, there's those leaked audio clips. I mean, although Zuckerberg has clearly made gobs and gobs of money off of Facebook, I mean, yeah, the guy, that guy's day to day is at times probably unenviable, but at other times probably very enviable. But anyway, what he was saying in these leaked audio clips is, hey guys, actually, the majority of our users seem to be conservatives, and the majority of our user complaints are that we are censoring conservatives, rather than the other way around, which was the narrative from the employees in Facebook, which have all, their political donations are through the left, through the roof for the left. Sure. So you got all these really interesting, very complicated dynamics. But the question here is, hey, Tim, do you allow your kids to use Facebook? At what age is it okay to start?
Well, I get to punt because my kids are 4 and 6. So no, they're not. And I do, for what it's worth, we're pretty draconian about using devices at all. Mainly through trial and error, we've realized that when they're on an iPad for a long time, at the end of it, they're not as pleasant to be around. And so it's not worth the, they're occupied for that hour that I gave them an iPad, but I pay for it. when they have to put it down. And I've learned, my wife and I have learned it's not worth it. So their screen time, and they probably do 10 minutes a week, 20 minutes a week at most. And we're really fortunate in the pandemic in that, we both have enough flexibility that we're able to do that. That I don't think that's necessarily, I don't say that should be the standard for quarantine at all, because I think people are in very, people's circumstances vary, and that just may not be realistic, particularly in quarantine. I'm just sharing with you.
20 minutes a week is like, does that even count? That just seems like a tease. You're just fair. Saying, there's a whole universe, but I'm not going to let you see it, child. But I mean, that's very interesting.
With kids that young, they forget. What we found is with kids that young, when it's daily, it's habitual, right? It's in their day-to-day consciousness. Like, hey, I want to watch a show. But if it's every 4, 5, 8 days, it doesn't get habituated, and they kind of forget. And it's not tempting them in the way that, well, at least that's what I'm telling myself. I might be delusional.
No, that's the whole premise here about moment, about,
Sure.
addiction,
Sure.
how do you break that cycle? And I think your point is, once you're in the cycle, it's near impossible to break. It's just a matter of, can you limit?
That's right. Yeah. And then look, I think that it's a really tricky situation as kids get older, because you can be draconian about these social services, social media services, but if your kid goes to school with 30 other kids, it's unlikely that their parents are going to be aligned with you. Now, there are frameworks. Probably the most well-known is Wait Till 8th, which is basically a framework that you can employ with your kids and the kids' parents in your son or daughter's classroom. And people do it as early as kindergarten. They try to get the whole group of parents to align on a norm, which is that we're not going to give our kids smartphones until they're in 8th grade, which is 13, 14. You can give them a phone, you can give them a dumb phone, but the point is to keep them off of these social networking services. I am hopeful, and I do think there's an interesting business to be built around this, whereby there's almost like a self-contained social network that people younger than 13 can use, but it's literally just like a messaging platform. Maybe this already exists and I just don't know it. A messaging platform for, the 3rd graders or 5th graders that they can use to communicate and be social with one another. But it's closed, it's private, the data is protected, and it has this natural way of deferring the point at which they get on a Snap or an Instagram or a TikTok. I think that's where we're going to head, because I just think there are too many stories of kind of 10-year-olds being on TikTok, and that just leading to all kinds of downstream issues. And the other thing you can do with these self-contained networks that potentially the school can be an administrator on is a lot of the challenges they have, at that age, 10 plus, is there's bullying online. But it's a he said versus she said, and there's no way, because there's no administrative privileges. When for me as a parent or an administrator of school on TikTok, I don't know who to believe. So it's a he said, she said battle between kids and parents and administrators. It's a mess. So I think that has to get and likely will get solved, especially on the heels of things like the social dilemma and this just coming into consciousness. And I think when it does, it's going to alleviate, I hope, at least some of the challenges that parents are facing with smartphones and these social media services. And when the right age, we're in the right age is to let them get on them.
That's a great point to leave it on. There's a $1 trillion idea if anyone wants to pursue it. And Tim, just wanted to truly say thank you for for putting the word out there, right, and taking a stand and coming on the show today, obviously. And if you haven't already, go check out Moment, and definitely hope to have you back on and keep us posted when the friend relationship app is coming out. And thanks again, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Alex.